Welcome to this week's Well Dweller podcast. I'm your host, Eric Freiberger, coming to you from Treaty 7 lands, Calgary, Alberta. Today, I am excited to share an amazing conversation I had this past week with David Ross. It took me a bit by surprise, sitting down with David Ross in the Riverside online studio. I gazed at my laptop screen with nostalgic amazement as he greeted me from his office in Alberta Bible College. Within a few seconds, I very quickly recognized the old office of my Professor John Wilson from 20 years ago. It brought a flood of memories as David and I warmed up to each other, getting ready for our conversation. In today's episode, David shares a truly inspiring story how OCD and the diagnosis of scrupulosity had imprisoned him in his basement in 2014 until his family and loving community of faith came around him to bring help that would free him from the entrapments of his mind. One powerful truth that I learned from my conversation with David this past week is that the liberation of the gospel for disabled people is never realized or fully possible through an individual's efforts alone. It can only be fully embraced by the whole body of Christ coming around the oppressed person or people, journeying with them through their darkest moments in life, and raising them out with gradual mercy and grace. Disability is never an easy walk or path to roll through in life. But when we surround ourselves with a community that transcends what the world calls imperfect, we can discover a freedom filled with perfect blessings and gifts that can strengthen our character. In the words of Marcel Proust, we then truly see the world with new eyes. So before we get into the conversation, we are about 3 weeks out from the Good News event I've been telling you about the last several weeks. And I want to invite you to register to attend the free event. We are hoping to have a deep and meaningful conversation around reigniting a prophetic imagination in being good news for and as disabled people today. And we've got some really exciting presenters that are going to be there. They're both past guests on the Well Dwellers podcast, John and his son Edward Van Sloten, and Reverend Lisa Waits. So please do check out those registration links on the Well Dwellers social pages, as well as in the resource tab of the show notes. Please also subscribe to the atthebottomofthewell.com newsletter, and you'll receive all the writings and activities that I get into there. And please do share today's episode and any other things that inspire you at the bottom of the well. I am honored that you're willing to listen, and I thank you for your support. And with that, let's get to our conversation with the amazing David Ross. All right, awesome. Well, David, it is great to finally meet you. I want to thank you, and I am deeply honored you joined me here on the Well Dwellers podcast, talking about disability, dignity, and hope. We both are here in Treaty 7, Calgary, Alberta. And yeah, thanks for being with me today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Eric. It's a real pleasure to be here and talk about these kind of sacred, important subjects. So thanks for the invite. I feel blessed to be here.
Oh, beautiful. I'm so, that's inspiring. You call it sacred already. This is excellent.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah, for the listeners, I know you and I have kind of just met here. Mm-hmm. And I know you've talked to Ty about me, and I've heard a bit about you from Ty. But for the listeners, maybe if you want to tell us a bit about yourself and where you're from, what you do currently, and something people may not know about you.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can do that. So I'm originally from Scotland. Some people can still hear the accent, some people can't. So my wife sometimes makes a little bit of fun of me if I'm letting myself lose my accent a little bit. So I sound a little Canadian now, but that's okay. So I'm from Aberdeen in Scotland, in the northeast of Scotland. Moved to Canada in 2009, which was right after high school. And it was supposed to be a gap year. But then the joke with a gap year is that you never go home. So I was supposed to be here for 5 months in Canada, but that was about 15 years ago now. So, and yeah, name's David Ross. My wife, Claire, and I have been married for 12 years now. We initially were in the Toronto area where we did a bunch of kind of Christian ministry related things. I was a youth pastor for a number of years there. And then we moved out to the Calgary area in 2014. We had got married in 2013. And right now I'm studying at the University of Toronto, which is a little bit odd given that I'm here in Calgary. But I'm doing a PhD there in New Testament. It's Wycliffe College associated with the U of T. So I can do most of that from here. I'm in Toronto regularly as well, but generally speaking, I can do it from here. And Eric, you and I have Alberta Bible College as a connecting factor in our lives. So I was did my undergrad at Alberta Bible College here in Calgary, and after that, obviously went on to do a little bit more studying. But they can't get rid of me. I'm back now, and as well as doing the PhD in New Testament, I'm teaching a bit here. I teach all kinds of different courses, whatever they need me to do. And then just recently, I began work as the student development dean here at Alberta Bible College. So that's great fun, kind of helping students in their kind of journey of spiritual growth and change and all the joys of education.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, 33 years old, love soccer, which I know really should be called football. And you had mentioned that I could maybe mention something that nobody knows about me and not many people know, which is my greatest fear, which I suppose is a bit of a intimidating place to begin a podcast interview. But most people are afraid of things like, height or the future or the dark or something. My greatest fear in life is dancing in public. So don't ask me why that is, but I presume you won't be asking me to dance on this program, Eric. So I think I'm safe for now.
I don't have that TikTok channel, so
Yeah,
I'm not sure
exactly.
we'll get much dancing. Yeah, yeah, and to be honest, I think it's maybe a graceful mercy upon me being in a wheelchair. I don't worry about dancing too much.
That's very true. Exactly. Yeah, very true. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. I did pick up a bit on the Scottish accent, and believe it or not, you are the second Scottish person to have
Really?
have on
Oh,
Well Dwellers podcast. Yeah, my
wonderful.
pastor James Payton in First
Okay.
Alliance. He's
Excellent.
he's a Scottish lad as well.
Yeah, we're a patriotic lot. Sometimes around Calgary, you can see it always tends to be these huge, big, like Ford F-150s or these Dodge Rams. You know how the front plate doesn't need to be an official plate in Alberta, so they often have the Scottish flag on there. So driving around the city, I can see all these patriotic Scots who have come here to buy a massive truck, apparently. So
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I love it. Yeah. See, it's easy. A couple days ago, we had St. Patrick's Day.
mhm.
And I hope I do this justice, but I had a good laugh at James's Facebook post. He put up this picture of like this Braveheart
Oh yeah,
character.
yeah,
And it says, everyone has a little bit of Irish in them on St. Patty's Day, but the
yeah.
Scots, we're still Scottish.
That's true. My wife is actually from Ireland, and sometimes people joke. They're like, "Oh, how does your marriage? Are you guys not at each other's throats all the time?" But it tends to be in the UK situation. Tends to be anyone but England is the kind of. I mean, I'm joking. I love my English brothers and sisters, but no, we've always got on well, having that shared. We grew up kind of in the same part of the world, so that's been a blessing for my wife and I.
Oh, okay. Wow. You and I, we might have some distant cousin blood in relation
Yeah,
to the
absolutely.
Irish, because
Yeah,
I have a bit of Irish blood in me, I'm told from past generations. So
that's great. Very good.
yeah. Wow. Excellent. So, Well Dwellers talks a lot about disability, and I find that everyone relates to the meanings of disability differently,
Hmm.
and they come into relationship with it at different points in life.
Right.
different connections and community. So I often like to ask my guests if they would maybe share a bit on what their relationship to disability is and what meanings it might have for you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a real privilege to be able to talk about this here. I think the best way for me to answer those questions or try and answer those questions is probably going to be tell at least a little bit about my kind of journey with disability, just to kind of frame it a little bit so people know where to place how I'm responding. So essentially, as I mentioned, I was in the Toronto area when I first moved to Canada. And oddly, you had actually pointed out there that people do come into contact with disability or they experience it at different stages in life, which is an important factor to take into consideration. So basically what happened to me was in 2020, which seems like a lifetime ago now, but I was youth pastoring in the kind of Toronto area. And up until that point, I had not had a history with disability. And so it actually came into my life at a relatively mature-ish age-wise stage. I was about 20 years old at that point in 2000. And so basically what happened was I was youth pastoring in a church and seemingly out of nowhere, I was just kind of caught in this kind of perfect storm of what I did not know at the time was OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. The symptoms began there in the summer of 2012, but I actually didn't get a diagnosis. As we talk about mental health, a big piece is often the insight piece in terms of, is the person aware that there's something wrong? And if so, are they aware of what is wrong and how the steps to take to get help? So even although my symptoms began in 2012, I had absolutely no idea what was going on. And it wasn't until February 2014 that I was diagnosed with severe OCD, anxiety, depression, and some psychosis. So basically what had happened was I was youth pastoring. Give a little bit of background. My teenage years in Scotland, I identified as a Christian. I grew up in a Christian home. I attended church. And for those here on the Well Dwellers podcast, I know that Eric, you do talk about religion and spirituality as it intersects with disability and hope and dignity and all these themes. But a big part of my OCD story is the religion, spirituality, Christianity piece. And so in my teenage years, I'd kind of lived quite a kind of, I didn't feel like I was particularly close to God. And then when I came to Canada, that was part of what was so magical for me about Canada, was that it was the place where I felt like God embraced me and really brought me closer to him. So in 2012, I was working as a youth pastor. Things were going so well. I was about to be engaged to my now wife. I had my dream job. I was helping young people with their kind of walk with God. I was in ministry. I had a bunch of friends. I felt close to God. I felt all this kind of joy and peace and the positive things we associate with religion when it's done in a positive way. But then really out of nowhere, I started having what people usually refer to now as intrusive thoughts. I had no idea what they were exactly, but I had I was just kind of going about, my youth ministry and my life and getting ready to get married. And suddenly these very intrusive and terrifying thoughts kind of began dominating my thinking. And it wasn't just a kind of regular thought that comes and goes. It was a very kind of abrasive, aggressive, frightening, kind of thoughts that were kind of attacking me and disturbing me. And I really didn't know what to make of that. Fast forward to 2014, I was diagnosed and began to get a little bit of education on the fact that OCD, when we talk about OCD, people are often thinking washing the hands or arranging things very neatly or just being precise or picky or that kind of thing. And those things can be part of how OCD expresses itself, but there's a wide range of how OCD manifests itself. And I think that's probably true for many different disabilities, whether they're mental health or otherwise. There's a broad range of ways that they manifest and the ways that they're experienced. But my variety of OCD, if you want to call it that, the official name of it is called scrupulosity, which is quite hard to say. So if you say that 10 times quickly, your tongue will fall out maybe. But basically, it's OCD that revolves around religion and morality.
Oh, really?
Which is quite interesting. And so, in a Christian setting, especially in my part of the kind of Christian world, which is the more charismatic Pentecostal part, there's often, the go-to is kind of, well, he needs some demons cast out of him or something like that. So there were some pretty negative experiences had there. But in terms of how I relate to disability, how I find myself experiencing it, um, basically how OCD works is you have these frightening thoughts. For me, they were related to morality or spirituality. So basically fear about doing something sinful, whether that be sometimes the thoughts would be related to violence. And people who know me know that I'm not that kind of person. Or maybe they would be, other kinds of morally unacceptable thoughts or in my mind, morally unacceptable thoughts, whether it's violence or racism or some kind of sexual thing or even some blasphemous thoughts. And the way OCD works is these thoughts come in, they trigger a great deal of anxiety. They're called obsessions. That's where the O comes from in the OCD.
Mm.
And the person who has the OCD responds to those with, this is terrifying. I'm going to do all these horrible things, which I don't want to do. I want to be, in my case, I want to be a faithful, holy, pure God following individual. And these thoughts are just scaring me senseless. And so what ends up happening is in response to the obsessions and the anxiety that they produce, you develop compulsions. That's where the C comes in the OCD. And for me, you're talking here, Eric, about how these things manifest or how I relate to them. If you were looking at me externally, you wouldn't necessarily have known anything was wrong. But internally, there were these compulsions, rituals of, I basically spent all day repenting, being terrified, asking God to protect me in my mind. And it got so bad that I had to step down from my job. I was youth pastoring. I had not done anything wrong. I hadn't underperformed or done anything wrong, but I just got so ill that I couldn't function. I was so terrified of doing something morally wrong that I was unable to work. My wife, Claire, had to leave her job to care for me. As things developed, it got so bad that wasn't willing to leave my basement, because if I leave my basement, I'll sin. I had a little timer thing that I used. I set it to go off every 15 seconds, and that would remind me every 15 seconds to pray intensely so that I wouldn't sin. So you can see here, disability has a wide range of ways that it manifests itself. And so that's a little bit of my journey of what OCD looked like for me and how I kind of interact with it. And it's been a long journey of kind of recovery and healing in the face of all that.
Yeah, absolutely. I know in previous discussions, I've talked a lot about how disability can be both in the visible sense and the invisible sense. And it's important that we describe both of those in the reality of disability and the way it impacts us and the way we find relationship with others as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think, I wondered about the moral sense, because sometimes morality is created by humanity's relationship with God, right?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes humanity's own perceptive understandings of morality is not necessarily the same way God is finding a relationship to it, which is
right.
I mean, I don't know how you might relate to that within the struggles and such with OCD.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it was just something that came to mind when you were talking about that too.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very applicable question. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I might also want to ask you your reference to psychosis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can you expand a bit on that? Like
Absolutely.
What is psychosis in your understanding and the way you present it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the education you get as someone who is experiencing OCD is, the thoughts are telling you, oh, I need to be afraid that this is going to happen or that's going to happen, or I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. But the psychological literature kind of tells you actually OCD targets what you value. And so actually it's all kind of smoke and mirrors. There is actually nothing kind of morally wrong with the person who has scrupulosity. It's just that they are being presented with these fears and those fears get out of control. So in terms of psychosis, the psychosis can have various causes and manifestations, but the basic definition I'm no expert here. I'm no psychologist, but the basic definition is when the person is unable to distinguish between what is real and what is imaginary, or what is real and what is not real. And in my case, I was diagnosed with psychosis when I went into hospital in 2014 in February. Basically, my psychosis was as a result of the severity of the OCD. Everyone in my life, my wife, my family, my colleagues, my friends knew that I was a very devout Christian. I was a very moral, virtuous, caring person who had no evidence in his life of any of these kind of, negative kind of sinful things. There was nothing violent. There was nothing racist. There was nothing sexual. But the OCD had got to such a point that it had convinced me that I was this kind of moral monster. And that was where the psychosis kicked in terms of I was just out of touch with reality, in the sense that, I was believed myself to be some kind of dangerous individual who kind of needed to be locked away. But that was not the case. To the point where I actually lost touch with even, if someone's talking to me in the room, I wasn't fully present or aware what was happening, because basically I was so driven to not do all these sinful things, that I was kind of picking myself apart and destroying myself with all these internal rituals of rigorous prayer, which in reality were not necessary, because it was OCD and psychosis that were terrifying me. There was no actual evidence in my life of anything that would cause concerns.
Man, yeah, my heart's feeling that. That's heavy, and really, I thank you for being vulnerable and sharing the story.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's important for people to hear how psychological and invisible disabilities can impact you and others in ways that severely not only cause trauma and damage internally, but can also affect the life and your abilities to connect with world and be involved. So, and I think that one of the things that I might also see in what you're describing is how disability doesn't just impact the singular person either. It just impact you alone. It impacted the relationships and the community around you too.
Yeah.
So, without, part of me wants to ask, how did your wife respond to this situation and the struggles you were having? And if you want to expand on it too, how was your church community and that reacting to this struggle?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very difficult thing for family and friends and my wife and my church community to observe, because they kind of saw this individual who was kind of flourishing in life. There was the absolute peak period of my life. Up until that point, I was doing so incredibly well. I was flourishing in ministry. I was flourishing in my engagement to Claire. I had great friendships. Everything was going really well. And then in the space of about a year, I kind of just disintegrated, and the illness kind of did that to me. And so I lost a great deal of weight. I became unable to kind of leave the house, these kinds of things. And people were kind of, obviously desperate to help. That's the situation in which they found themselves. And oftentimes, if someone has OCD, where these obsessive thoughts are making them terrified of things that are not actually, there's no actual need to be afraid of these things. The first thing you want to do is reassure the individual, like, oh, no, you don't have to worry about this, that kind of thing. But actually so that was a challenge for my friends and family. We need to help David, something we don't quite know what's going on with him, but he obviously needs our help. And so you come in and you kind of attempt to reassure the individual. But, with the tools of psychology, we've learned that that's actually kind of the opposite of what the OCD person needs. Because when you try to assuage, like reduce the anxiety, it actually reinforces the kind of strength of the fear and the anxiety and the compulsions.
Really?
And so the way that you eventually heal from OCD, I'm sure you've heard of CBT, Eric. Cognitive behavioral therapy. So it's a well-known approach for dealing with various mental health challenges. And basically, what the person with OCD needs to hear and what they need to kind of recover and get a bit of their life and their agency back is rather than trying to reassure them with their fears and their anxieties, actually they not responding to these thoughts is what actually helps. The thought comes in, you have to be afraid of this, that, or the next thing. And the way you eventually heal is, well, actually, I don't have to be afraid of these things, because this is just an illness that is kind of tormenting me. So it was difficult, this desire to help. My family were desperate to help, but it took us a while to learn what help actually looked like. Because oftentimes there's the intention to help, there's the sincerity, but unless you understand the nature of OCD, you may not be aware of, and that applies, I'm sure, to multiple forms of disability. There needs to be some thoughtfulness around what people who are disabled actually need and want from those around them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Actually, I have heard about cognitive behavioral therapy. Before the acronym got me a little off.
Yeah, sure.
But I really appreciate you highlighting that importance, that the way you approach is not by suppressing it, reducing it, but rather coming alongside them. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, very good. Thinking of community as well in that same stream, you think of the biblical example, and I kind of shared with you John 9 as an example before.
Right.
The idea that sometimes a community will look upon those with disabilities and why is this person the way they are? Did God create this?
Right.
Was it from sin? What brought this on? How have you managed to theologically work through that and approach that understanding when it comes to where your OCD struggles and psychosis and that, where that all had come from?
Yeah, absolutely. That's an important question, and it's a deep one in terms of there are depths and nuances to that question. It's interesting as well to be asked that question as a Christian who's part of the kind of charismatic Pentecostal theological Christian world, because obviously there's this big big emphasis on divine healing, with the ministries of John Wimber with the Vineyard and all these kinds of things. One of the things that I love the charismatic movement, and I do believe in divine healing. I believe that God still does that kind of thing today. But I think some of the way that that's manifested itself in charismatic Pentecostal circles has been really quite, put it mildly, unhelpful, maybe even harmful at times, where the person with the disability basically is viewed as a problem which God or the anointed man or woman of God is here to solve. And part of what I want to do by coming on this podcast is really encourage charismatics and Pentecostals to read a little bit of disability theology and the idea that people who have disabilities, whether they're visible, invisible, whether they're body related, mind related, or whatever it may be, rather than just kind of passive recipients of problem solving, not only is the individual an active, viable member who can contribute to the community, the disability itself is not necessarily a negative thing in many ways. So to get back to your kind of original question, with John 9, the Gospel of John there, chapter 9, Jesus heals a man who was born blind. And there's these questions around, like you were saying, where did this blindness come from? Was it something that the blind man himself had sinned and this had brought it upon him? His parents done something wrong and that had resulted in this kind of disability that he was experiencing? Was it God's intention for him to be born this way? Is it God's intention to take him out of that situation as Jesus did in that setting? So what I would say there is that I think I'll just stay on my turf, as it were, and kind of speak to my own experience. On the one hand, I experienced a lot of suffering and difficulty and pain as a result of developing this illness, which terrified me and convinced me that I was some kind of moral monster, when in reality, that was a complete fiction. And so on the one hand, OCD has been tremendously painful and has engendered and created a great deal of suffering in my life. So in that sense, you could say, well, I don't think God wanted me to suffer in that way. I think God brings, like this podcast is so focused on, I think God brings hope and dignity rather than degradation and despair. On the other hand, though, I don't see my OCD as an overall or fundamentally negative thing or something that's wrong with me or a weakness or a problem that needs to be fixed or washed away. I'll give you a silly example. With OCD, kind of classed as an anxiety disorder. So there's a great deal of anxiety. And for me, and with OCD, the anxiety always revolves around something which is not actually a problem. It's just the person who has OCD perceives it to be a problem. So with someone with the cleanliness thing, they may fear that they're going to get, from using a public toilet, they may fear they're going to get some deadly illness. So they wash their hands so much that their hands bleed. Well, that's actually not necessary. It's a It's a deception, kind of trickery kind of thing. But the positive end of it is, although there's this suffering associated with OCD many times, the contribution that I, as a disabled person with OCD, have to bring, or one of the contributions that I have to bring to my community, including my church community and the Christian community, is that I am profoundly and extremely observant and careful and watchful. Because if you think about morality, and you're terrified of doing this, that, or the other negative thing, what does that produce in you? Extreme vigilance about all things moral and spiritual and religious. I'll give you a silly example. When I was starting my PhD in Toronto, I needed to get the GO train. Those of you who are in the GTA will know what I'm talking about, but it's basically some of the public transit set up in the kind of general Toronto area. And so people would always talk about, don't forget, you have your Presto card. Again, this is nonsense for some people, but it's a card that you load cash onto and you pay for your train journey with it. But you got to remember to tap on, you put it up against a little, kind of like you were paying with a credit card, you tap it and it beeps. And then you got to remember to tap off when you get to your destination. Because if you don't tap off, they're going to charge you as if you went, to Ottawa or whatever. But you got to remember to tap on and to tap off. And I remember, my family members were saying, oh, make sure you don't forget to tap off because you'll be charged double or whatever. And this is a silly example, but as someone who has OCD and spent a decade of his life too scared to do much of anything, to leave his basement, I will never forget to tap on and tap off, because I have this kind of God ordained kind of cautiousness, carefulness, particularness, watchfulness. And I think, although that tap on, tap off of the GO train is a little silly, $10 isn't a big deal here or there on public transit. But when you bring that into a church community, if someone's not been there for 2 weeks, I will notice. If someone's struggling, whatever that may be with, maybe they're having relationship challenges, maybe they're having spiritual challenges, maybe they need someone to go for coffee with, I'm going to notice. So there's this kind of extreme kind of detail-orientated, watchful, careful, precise, organized. And I think, like you say, many people perceive a disability as something that God wants nothing to do with, and God is just a problem for people to come in and solve. Well, actually, my OCD in that sense is a real contribution. I can be a part of the body of Christ, and I can be aware of where we're at as a spiritual family and what we need to pay attention to and what we need to think about. So in that sense, my disability is a means by which I can contribute rather than just being some passive, helpless victim kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Ty and I have actually been talking this morning a bit on my time with Alan Hirsch a few weeks ago and his views on Ephesians 4 and APEST, the apostle, prophet, evangelist, teacher, and shepherd.
Right. Yeah.
And what you're kind of describing gives me a real impression of the prophetic role, the way that the prophet sees and knows things that are happening within the community, the social environment, and the individual, and calls it out.
Yeah.
And so, I wonder if we even look into the biblical prophets, how many of the biblical prophets may have had such a gifting, if you want to call it that, of OCD. Within their DNA?
That's actually a very interesting question. As I mentioned, I'm doing a PhD in New Testament right now. So some biblical, this kind of thing comes as a shock sometimes to kind of traditional kind of evangelical charismatic Christians. But so I don't want to throw anyone too much for a loop here, but some biblical scholars have wondered if Ezekiel might have had some mental health challenges. The kinds of thing, if you remember the biblical book of Ezekiel, he walks around naked, he lies on one side for months on end and then switches over, lies on the other side for months on end. And he does these kind of strange pantomime kind of things. And obviously the biblical text understands this to be divinely inspired prophetic ministry, which I think it absolutely is. But some have wondered if Ezekiel may have had some struggles with his kind of mental stability and well-being, and whether God may have been using that, as you say, as a kind of a unique way in which he can communicate to his people Israel about just what you're saying, noticing. That's what the prophets of the Hebrew Bible did. They noticed when things were not as they should be. And as you say, they called them out. And not only just in the negative kind of calling out sense, but also in the shepherding, pastoral, hey, how is this person doing today? Maybe your pastor even. to many people, they may seem to, it's just another sermon from their pastor, but not that my gifts are any better or worse than anyone else's, but with someone with OCD, this profound, detail-orientated, searching, scanning, watching, observing. If my pastor is struggling or one of my friends at church is struggling, like I say, I'll probably notice. And then I'll be able to kind of try and come alongside them and just be there for them in whatever way I might be able to.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you could also see that in Nathan, right? With
Mm-hmm.
David.
Exactly.
Sees something, doesn't call it out in the sense of look what he did.
No.
Rather comes alongside him and walks with him through the fallout that had taken place with him and his household.
Yeah.
And the adultery that he had committed. But
yeah, and so I suppose the Hebrew prophets, you could say, they're being used by God to call out and to indict, which they are, but God's motivation in calling out our sin and indicting injustice is always ultimately to bring about mercy and restoration. So yeah, that's a good point.
Hey, so we're kind of talking a bit about dignity, and I think that connects with our spirituality as well. Mm-hmm. So how, as you talked earlier, morality, and that is, of course, deeply impacted by your spiritual roots and your religious connections. How did you venture through to find it to reinstill a sense of dignity and a wholeness in you, bring healing to the struggles you were facing in 2014?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a very good question. And so, as I've said, I'm kind of more from the charismatic Pentecostal stream of Christianity. And so what do you kind of expect when you have a health issue of some kind? You're kind of waiting for God to kind of strike you with a lightning bolt and just heal you instantaneously. And that's one way in which I had a lot to learn there. God does sometimes do things like that. I'm not discounting that. But for the first 6 to 9 months of me being severely ill in 2012, 2013, I was so terrified of doing these things which I had never done and would never do. And everyone but me knew I would never do them. But, I was so terrified. I was like, God's going to heal me. God's going to take it away. It's going to, 9 months, 2 months from now, it'll be gone. It'll be taken care of. And what actually ended up happening was this very long, those of us who have, at that point, I was quite young still. I didn't have all that much life under my belt, maybe a little bit of immaturity, you could say, but I came to realize that sometimes God does these dramatic, interventions. And again, I don't discount that. I think that does happen from time to time. But my journey was one of very slow, very gradual healing and restoration of dignity. Again, the way OCD works as an illness, if you talk to kind of professional, qualified psychologists, psychiatrists, people who have spent their life studying these illnesses, they will point out that OCD targets what you value. So for me, that was being a morally pure and holy and virtuous individual. For someone else, it could be something else. A story I heard about was a mother who's just given birth to a baby. And this particular mother absolutely loves her child. The one thing she wants more than anything else in the whole world is to be a fantastic mother to her child. And this is a real thing that does happen to people. She began having these intrusive thoughts of harming her baby. So OCD goes after the very thing that the person has staked their whole life on doing well. And so then the mother begins to kind of have all these concerns about harming her baby, which actually is not something she's ever going to do because that's not who she is. It's the illness tricking her and deceiving her and throwing her off and throwing her into anxiety. So in terms of the healing process, it really came about with this learning to trust God. And again, when we're kind of younger, maybe chronologically and maybe earlier in our spiritual walk, we kind of think that even if we wouldn't say it like this, we think that trusting God means nothing bad's going to happen. He's going to he's going to protect me from everything. He's going to take everything away. I'm not going to suffer. I'm not going to go through anything hard. But I began to learn how I actually recovered and kind of regained this sense of health and dignity is very long. I won't go into all the details because it would just take too long. But basically, through working with therapists, through getting on certain kinds of medication, working with psychiatrists, psychologists, people of faith, pastors who supported me, I came to the conclusion that God himself, as a charismatic, we believe that God still speaks today. And that doesn't need to be some big grandiose, I'm the prophet of God and you have to do what but it's kind of that still small voice that Elijah talks about, where God is leading his people and guiding his people. And although I still have OCD, I'm not traumatized and in deep suffering as a result of it. And how I made that recovery was I came to the belief that God was communicating to me through all these people, the psychological literature, the psychiatrists, the psychologists, my family, my church community. I came to believe that God was communicating to me, you're terrified you're going to do these things, but it's the illness. This is not who you are. You are a trustworthy, loving, kind, moral person. And I believe that God was communicating that to me. And eventually I learned to believe that, even though my illness was so potent in its ability to try and convince me of the opposite. So for me, dignity came from trusting God. Not that I lost any dignity, objectively, but my regaining of my sense of completeness, wholeness, and dignity really came from that journey of, hey, everything in my senses and my mind is telling me that I can't trust God, but I'm leaning into that journey where I learn to trust what he's saying to me and the ways in which he is leading me out of suffering and pain and degradation and into wholeness and that Hebrew idea of shalom, of completeness and wellness.
Mm-hmm. You're talking about shalom and the way things are the way they were meant to be.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people with disabilities sometimes wonder, when I come in the resurrected form, will I be without disability?
Right.
Love to hear your response here. Will you, when you come in the resurrected body, will OCD be no more?
Yeah. That's a big question. And again, I feel like, Eric, you've got me a little bit above my pay grade here in terms of, these are big, tough questions, right? But what I immediately think of is we think of Jesus and many disability theologians. I have some friends in my PhD program who their whole dissertation is focused on disability theology and bringing liberation and dignity to people who experience these things. But one of the things they point out is Jesus in his resurrected body, he still had his scars. He still had his wounds, which is like just Christianity. I appreciate the contributions of other religions too, but I think there's something very profound and unique about Christianity in the sense that, the idea that God became a man and then participated in our sufferings and then died a shameful death for us. And then even when God comes and fixes everything and resurrects him, he still has these visible, what you could say, kind of a form of disability. I don't know him, so I'm kind of name dropping here, but I need to get the name right. Maybe I won't mention the name in case I get it wrong, but there's a very well-known academic book that has just come out. One is called The Disabled God, and one is called Disability in the Letters of Paul. Paul had this thorn in the flesh. Some people think it might have been an eye injury or anyway, this is a very circuitous way of answering your question. But I would say, when we look at Revelation 21 and 22, God does seem to remove suffering. I'll wipe away every tear from your eye. The old ways are passing away. Behold, I'm making all things new. So in that sense, I don't think people will be suffering in the new heavens and the new earth. Again, there may be people listening to this podcast who don't come from a faith background, so some of this might be a bit mumbo jumbo to you, but which I appreciate. But basically, my conviction as a Christian is that when God makes everything right in the end, which he's committed to do, those who have followed him, the suffering will be no more. Does that mean that I won't have any traceable OCD related things in my resurrected body and the new heavens and the new earth? I don't think so, because as I've said, God made me to be focused. God made me to be precise. God made me to be detail orientated. God made me to be conscientious. God made me to be someone who gives his all. And again, remember, the OCD targets what you value. So if your concerns related to your OCD are religious and moral, the OCD is convincing you you're a moral monster, but what does that actually mean? It actually means the most important thing in your whole life is following God, treating people well, being a moral individual. Or for the mother whose OCD revolves around harm, she can be confident that she's a fantastic mother and she loves her baby and would do anything for her baby. So again, a long way of answering your questions, but I would say God will remove the suffering in the end. But I don't think that means that disability will just vanish. I think it's still going to be part of my contribution. I will still be rigorously detail-oriented, observant, watchful, careful, conscientious, these kinds of things.
Yeah, that is very deep and rich. I know if it was me listening to this podcast, I'd skip back about 2 minutes and listen through this all again, because you have shared so much in that last few statements.
Yeah.
I do want to say, are you thinking of Disabled God by...
I know the name, but I don't want to miss...
Lisa Powell?
Yes, exactly. That book is relatively new and it's really making the rounds. And again, my world, or a big part of my world, is academic theology. So it's kind of making waves and generating a lot of discussion. And I haven't read it myself, but I've heard very favorable things about it.
Yeah, I'm going to leave it in the show notes along with the Paul book. I'm going to look them up.
Yeah.
And I'll put a link to them for our listeners in the show notes.
Mm-hmm.
One more kind of deep question, and we'll maybe start to close out. But as someone who's part of the charismatic movement, and I am sure you have a lot of questions brought to you from those sides of the movements that are deep into faith healing and such. Now, I myself, and I know others with disabilities, are confronted with these from time to time. But as you are a part of that kind of side of Christianity, what is a healthy response to those kind of movements? And how do you speak to them in a loving way?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question, Eric. Yeah, I would say the first thing that needs to be said is that although I'm still a charismatic and a Pentecostal, and I'm not ashamed of that, hiding from that, it's still something I identify with and believe and think has a positive contribution to make to Christianity and to the world. At the same time, we need to acknowledge that this kind of branch of Christianity, the faith healing side, has in certain instances, in many instances, done profound harm to individuals with disabilities and to their families and to their communities. And there's no need to kind of necessarily name names or point fingers. But again, this paradigm of people with disabilities are a problem. They're that infamous archaic term for someone with a disability, an invalid, an invalid. And oftentimes in the charismatic Pentecostal world, in times past and times present, a person with a disability has basically been an opportunity for the anointed man or woman of God to flex their anointedness and kind of have this miraculous healing happen. And the whole thing is a kind of downward focused, this individual is a problem, an invalid, and I'm going to swoop in as God's chosen man or woman to save them from this victimhood that they can't escape themselves. And so what I would say to charismatics and Pentecostals is, the biblical, the Hebrew wisdom tradition exhorts us to be slow to speak and quick to listen. Well, have we been listening to people who actually, which is why the work you're doing here is so important, have people, charismatics, Pentecostals, especially people in positions of leadership, especially people whose ministries do focus on the praying for healing, have they listened to disability theologians? Have they listened to people's lived experience? And have they broken that mindset of you're a problem for me to come in and fix? The real God-given biblical perspective is people with disabilities are equal members of the community, and they, in their disabledness, have a profound contribution to make. Maybe I will just mention this final thing. I have a friend who, like I said, is a disability theologian doing her PhD, and she pointed out that one of the unique contributions that disabled people have to make to Christianity and to the church is the Bible all the way through disowns this idea of kind of self-sufficiency, relying on the self, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. Well, this particular individual who I'm talking about, she's a disability theologian. She functions, she needs a wheelchair. And she is basically pointing out that as someone with a disability, he doesn't have the ability to not be dependent on other people. She needs other people to assist her to function in life. And rather than that being something demeaning or degrading, he actually has something very profound to teach us. There's many of us who are very good at being self-sufficient and don't need God and don't need anyone else. And, it's, I've got it all together and I've got it figured out and I'm my own savior. I am the answer to my own problems. While this individual, her whole life, she cannot escape being in dignified ways dependent on other people and in need of help. And that is actually something that is a profound gift that she can give to able-bodied folk who don't necessarily have to think as regularly or as consistently about the fact that they too are profoundly dependent on God, on their community, on the people around them. So I would also say that I think there is a healthy and a moral and an integrous and an empathetic way to pray for healing in certain contexts and certain situations. I still believe that Jesus' ministry, a huge component of it was releasing people from suffering. And oftentimes that suffering came from forms of disability. So I still think there's a place for Pentecostals to believe God to intervene in people's lives. But I think what we need to get away from is this kind of top-down. Another friend of mine talks about it as noble me, needy you. I'm here as the anointed man or woman of God to save this poor victim from their situation. Well, that is a posture that has no resonance with the life of Jesus or the character of Jesus or the ministry of Jesus. When Jesus brought healing to people, he was someone who bestowed dignity, who overflowed with dignity. No one came away from time with Jesus feeling degraded or demeaned. To connect with Jesus was to be loved, to be embraced, to be valued, to be dignified, to be invited into partnership.
Wow. Yeah. The story that's coming to me is the picture of Jesus on the cross speaking down to Mary and John of
right.
Mother, behold your son.
Yeah.
Son, behold your mother.
Exactly.
Interdependent reality that in embracing salvation, embracing the challenges of life and death and all that, it's an interdependent reality.
Right.
That our identities are entwined with one another. It's not an individual sense of knowing yourself alone.
Right.
And this is beautiful. Before we close out there, I would love to have you come back another time.
Absolutely.
It would be awesome.
Yeah, I would love that. Thanks again for having me, Eric. It's been a real joy. And you and I need to catch up for the connection beyond the walls of this podcast as well.
Yeah, let's do that. We'll definitely grab coffee. But let our listeners know where they can learn more about you and what you're up to. I know you have a blog site.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for that opportunity to give some of those details. So I blogged regularly at renewingrenewal.com. Again, that may seem a bit like, what on earth is that about for people who are not in this kind of Christian charismatic world? But basically my thoughts, some of my sermons that I preach at church sometimes, some of my written musings in blog form of this whole charismatic Pentecostal world, which I absolutely love and am committed to. I think God is calling charismatics and Pentecostals to reconsider certain significant things. And so my renewingrenewal.com is really just some thoughts as to how we might kind of still hold on to what's good in our tradition, our branch of the church, but maybe be a little reflective about some of the areas of our theology and practice that need some readjusting or some rethinking. I'm also on Facebook, and Blue Sky. So, David Paxton Ross or David P. Ross. And then as I mentioned, I'm working here at Alberta Bible College as an adjunct professor and student development dean. So you can also reach me my details are kind of there on the abccampus.ca is the college's website. And people are welcome to reach out to me if they have questions about what we've talked about here. I would welcome people to reach out to me if they would find that helpful, if they'd like that.
That's awesome. Yeah. I'm so thankful you've been on the Well Dweller podcast, David. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Eric.